If you stay here one more minute, you won't be able to leave at all. That was the first thing I heard before everything changed, and I still don't know why I believed him. My name is Emily Carter, and that night I was just trying to finish a double shift at a luxury hotel in Manhattan, the kind of place where people wear watches worth more than my yearly rent and never look twice at the people serving them. The air inside the ballroom was warm, filled with soft music and polite laughter, but something about it always felt fragile to me, like glass about to crack if you press too hard. I remember adjusting my uniform for the third time, forcing a tired smile as I carried a tray of drinks past tables of guests who spoke in quiet, confident voices about deals I could never understand. I told myself I was invisible, like I always did, because invisibility made the job easier, but that illusion ended the moment I noticed them. 3 men near the far side of the room, dressed too sharply, sitting too still, their presence pulling attention even when no one dared to look directly at them. I felt it first in my chest, that subtle warning you don't ignore, the instinct that tells you something is wrong before your mind can explain why. I turned away, trying to focus on my work, but then I saw him. Vincent Callahan. He wasn't like the others, not loud, not trying to be seen, yet somehow the entire room bent around his silence. He sat alone at a table near the shadows, his posture calm, his gaze steady, as if nothing in the room could surprise him. I didn't know his name yet, only that there was something unsettling about how aware he seemed of everything, including me. When I passed his table, I felt it again, that quiet pressure of being observed, not judged, just seen. And then everything shifted. A group of guests moved closer to the center, voices rising slightly, attention distracted, and in that small opening of noise and movement, I felt a presence behind me. Not threatening, not loud, just close enough that my breathing slowed without permission. Emily Carter, a voice said softly, as if it already knew me. I froze, turning slowly, my heart suddenly too loud. In my ears. Vincent Callahan stood there now, closer than I realized he could move without being noticed, his expression unreadable but focused entirely on me. You need to listen carefully, he said, his voice calm in a way that made it harder to ignore. I opened my mouth to ask how he knew my name, but he stepped just slightly closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. You're in danger, he said simply, like it was a fact, not a warning. I should have stepped back, should have asked questions, should have called security, but something in his tone stopped me before I could move. There was no panic in him, no hesitation, only certainty. Then he said it, the words that didn't make sense at first, but somehow changed everything anyway. Pretend I'm your husband. I stared at him, confused, waiting for the joke or the explanation, but neither came. Instead, he gently tilted his head toward the far end of the room where I saw a movement I hadn't noticed before. People watching, waiting, too still for a public place like this. My pulse tightened, but before I could react, Vincent offered his hand, not forcing, not grabbing, just waiting. Trust me, he said quietly, and for reasons I didn't understand then, I did. I placed my hand in his, and the moment I did, the entire room seemed to shift, as if I had stepped into a story I was no longer allowed to leave. His hand did not pull me forward, yet I still followed him as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than thought. The moment my fingers rested in his, the noise of the ballroom seemed to shift, not disappearing but moving farther away, like I had stepped behind invisible glass. I remember blinking, trying to understand why everything suddenly felt slower, why my own breathing sounded distant and uneven. Vincent Callahan walked beside me without urgency, his presence steady, controlled, as if he had already calculated every possible outcome of this moment long before I ever stepped into it. Around us, guests continued their conversations, glasses clinked softly, and laughter rose in careful waves, but none of it seemed to reach us anymore. I wanted to ask him what was happening, who he was, why he knew my name, but the question stayed trapped behind my teeth because something in his expression told me answers would not come easily or quickly. Instead, he leaned slightly closer as we walked, just enough for his voice to cut through the noise without drawing attention. Do not look back, he said calmly, and I realized only then that I had already started to turn my head toward the room we were leaving behind. I stopped immediately, swallowing the instinct, forcing my eyes forward even though every part of me wanted to understand what I was walking away from. The hallway outside the ballroom was quieter, colder, the lighting softer and more clinical compared to the golden warmth behind us. My heels clicked against the polished floor in a rhythm that felt too loud, too exposed, and I suddenly became aware of how fast my heart was beating. Vincent did not let go of my hand. He guided me through the corridor with the same calm certainty, passing staff who lowered their gazes as he walked by, as if they had been trained not to question his presence. I noticed the way people reacted to him without speaking, small shifts in posture, subtle pauses, like his name alone carried weight I did not yet understand. At the end of the hallway, a set of glass doors opened automatically, revealing a quieter service entrance leading toward the side exit of the hotel. Cold air rushed in as we approached, brushing against my skin and making me realize how warm I had been inside without noticing. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my instincts finally catching up with my body, and Vincent felt it immediately. He stopped, not turning fully, but enough that I could see the side of his face. "You are safe right now," he said, not as reassurance, but as fact. I searched his expression for any sign of deception, but there was none, only focus, like he was holding something fragile together by sheer control. Outside, through the glass, I could see faint movement near the curb, dark shapes of vehicles waiting near the entrance, engines idling quietly in the night. Something about it made my stomach tighten, though I did not know why. Vincent stepped slightly closer again, lowering his voice even further. "This is why you had to act like you were with me," he continued. "Some people only see what they are allowed to see." I did not understand what he meant, but I understood enough to feel the weight of his warning settle inside me. The doors opened automatically, and the night air of Manhattan poured in, sharp and cool against my face. He guided me outside without hesitation, and for the first time, I noticed the way the world beyond the hotel felt larger, emptier, and far less predictable than the one I had just left behind. Vincent finally released my hand, but only after we had stepped fully into the shadows near the side of the building. He turned toward me then, fully now, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Stay close," he said quietly, and though I did not yet understand why, I found myself listening. The night air outside the hotel felt sharper than I expected, cutting through the warmth that still clung to my skin as I stood close to Vincent Callahan near the side entrance where shadows gathered along the brick wall. The city of Manhattan stretched around us in distant lights and slow-moving traffic, but everything near us felt unusually still, as if the world had narrowed down to only what he allowed me to see. I kept my hands close to my sides, unsure where they were supposed to be, unsure what role I was still playing in whatever strange situation I had stepped into only minutes earlier. Vincent stood slightly ahead of me now, not blocking me, but positioned in a way that made it clear he was aware of everything around us without needing to look directly at it. He adjusted his posture slightly, scanning the street with calm precision, and then he spoke again in a low, steady voice that barely rose above the distant hum of traffic. "Do not step away from this position," he said, and I nodded without thinking, surprised at how naturally I obeyed someone I had just met. A car passed slowly at the end of the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the sidewalk before disappearing into the distance, and I noticed how Vincent tracked it without moving his head, as if memorizing patterns rather than reacting to them. I wanted to ask him what was happening, why he had told me to pretend anything at all, but every question I formed felt heavier than the last, like it required knowledge I did not yet have. Instead, I focused on breathing normally, on keeping my hands steady, on reminding myself that I was simply a waitress who had finished her shift and was now standing outside a hotel with a stranger who spoke like every word carried meaning beyond its surface. Vincent finally turned slightly toward me again, his expression unchanged but his attention fully present. "You are going to walk with me," he said calmly, "and you are going to stay close enough that anyone watching will assume you belong beside me." The phrase made my chest tighten, not from fear exactly, but from the strange implication of being placed into someone else's life so easily, as if identity could shift based on proximity alone. I hesitated, and he noticed immediately, lowering his voice just enough to soften the edge of authority without losing control. "I am not asking you to trust me forever," he added, "only long enough to leave this place safely." That sentence should have reassured me more than it did, but instead it made everything feel even more uncertain because it confirmed that there was something to leave safely from. I glanced back toward the hotel entrance despite his earlier warning, and for a brief moment I saw movement near the glass doors, silhouettes passing through reflections and light, though I could not tell if anyone was looking at us or simply passing by. Vincent followed my gaze but did not react outwardly, only stepping slightly closer to close the distance between us again. "Keep walking," he said quietly, and this time I did. We moved together along the edge of the building, the pavement beneath us smooth and slightly damp from earlier rain, the sound of our steps mixing with the distant city noise. I became aware of how deliberately he adjusted his pace to match mine, never rushing me, never pulling ahead, but always maintaining a quiet control of direction. As we reached the corner where the street widened and light from passing cars became more visible, I realized I no longer felt like I was simply leaving a building, but like I was crossing into something I could not yet define. Vincent glanced at me once, briefly, and said in a tone almost too calm to question, "From this moment, you are exactly where you need to be." The moment we crossed the corner of the building, the sound of the city changed slightly, becoming fuller, more open, as if the world had widened again after being held in a narrow space for too long. I stayed close to Vincent Callahan without fully understanding why it felt necessary, only aware that every step he took seemed intentional, like he already knew where we were going even if I did not. The sidewalk was brighter here, lit by tall streetlights that cast long shadows across the pavement, and I noticed how he positioned himself slightly between me and the street without making it obvious. A few cars passed slowly, their headlights sweeping across us, and I suddenly became aware of how exposed I felt standing outside a luxury hotel at night with someone I barely knew. Vincent did not speak for several seconds, and the silence between us was not empty. It felt controlled, like he was deciding when words were necessary. Finally, he said, "You are processing what just happened." His tone was calm, not questioning, and I almost laughed at how accurate it was, except nothing about this situation felt humorous. I nodded slightly, unsure how to explain the mixture of confusion and awareness building inside me. "You do not need all the answers immediately," he continued, still walking at a steady pace beside me. "You only need to understand that leaving with me was the safest choice available to you." The way he said it made it sound like safety was not a feeling, but a calculation, something measured and decided before I ever had a chance to question it. We passed a row of closed storefronts, their windows dark and reflective, and for a brief moment I caught my own reflection beside him. I looked out of place, still wearing a simple uniform under a light jacket, while he looked like someone who belonged to a completely different level of the city, someone used to moving without hesitation. I studied him quietly, trying to find something that explained his certainty, but his expression remained steady, focused forward, as if attention itself was a resource he did not waste. "Why me?" I finally asked, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. It was not accusation, just confusion, something I had been holding since the moment he spoke my name. Vincent did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowed slightly, allowing me to match his pace more easily, and then he spoke with careful restraint. "Because you were seen by the wrong people at the wrong time," he said, and I happened to be close enough to correct that. The answer should have made me feel worse, but instead it grounded the situation into something I could at least understand, even if only partially. I glanced behind us again, this time more cautiously, and noticed nothing unusual, only distant pedestrians and passing vehicles, the normal rhythm of a city that never truly stopped. Still, the feeling that something had shifted did not leave me. Vincent guided us toward a quieter street where a black car was already waiting at the curb with its engine running softly. He opened the rear door without looking away from the surroundings, then turned slightly toward me. "We are not staying here," he said simply. I hesitated again, and this time he did not speak further, only waiting, giving me a choice that did not feel like a choice at all. After a brief moment, I stepped forward and entered the car, and as the door closed behind me, I realized the city outside no longer felt like something I was part of, but something I was now moving away from. The moment I settled into the back seat, the door closed with a soft final sound that felt heavier than it should have, as if it marked a decision I could not reverse. The interior of the car was quiet, insulated from the noise of Manhattan outside. And for the first time since leaving the hotel, I felt the full weight of what had just happened begin to settle in my chest. Vincent Callahan entered the front passenger seat a moment later, not the driver, which surprised me more than I expected, and he gave a quiet instruction to the driver that I did not fully hear. Before the car began to move smoothly into traffic, the city lights slid across the windows in slow streaks of gold and white, and I found myself watching them without really processing them, my thoughts still trying to catch up with everything that had happened in the last few minutes. Vincent turned slightly in his seat, enough that I could see his profile in the dim interior lighting, but not enough to feel like he was fully facing me. "You are safe for now," he said calmly, as if he was confirming a status rather than offering reassurance. I swallowed, my hands resting tightly in my lap, unsure what to do with the silence that followed. "Who were those people?" I finally asked, my voice quieter than I intended. It felt like the most important question I had ever asked, and yet I was not sure I wanted the answer. Vincent did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked out the window for a brief moment, as if organizing his thoughts, then turned back slightly. "People who operate in spaces where attention creates risk," he said carefully, choosing his words with precision. "And you were observed at the wrong moment in the wrong place." I tried to make sense of that, but it remained just out of reach, like a language I almost understood but could not fully translate. The car turned onto a wider avenue, the buildings becoming taller and more distant as we left the crowded hotel district behind. I noticed how smoothly everything moved, how the driver never seemed to hesitate, as if the route had already been decided long before I entered the vehicle. Vincent continued after a pause, his voice lower now, more direct. "I did not intervene because I was curious," he said. "I intervened because leaving you there would have created unnecessary consequences." The word consequences made my stomach tighten slightly, not because of what I understood, but because of what I did not. I looked at him more closely now, trying to see past the calm surface he presented, but there was nothing obvious to read. He was not emotional, not reactive, just controlled, as if control itself was the default state he never stepped out of. "You do not need to trust me," he added after a moment, almost as if he had noticed my silence. "You only need to stay within reach until I confirm the situation is resolved." That sentence should have made me feel trapped, but instead it made me feel oddly directed, like I was no longer drifting through confusion alone. The city outside grew quieter as we moved further away from the center, the lights becoming more spaced apart, the traffic thinner, the atmosphere calmer, but not less tense. I leaned back slightly against the seat, exhaling slowly, realizing only then how much I had been holding my breath without noticing. Vincent did not look at me again for a while, but his presence in the car remained constant, like a steady point in an otherwise shifting reality. After a long stretch of silence, he spoke again, softer than before. "You will have questions," he said, "and I will answer what you need to function safely." I stared at him for a moment, trying to understand what kind of life treated answers as something rationed rather than shared freely. Outside, the city continued to move, unaware of the small shift that had taken place inside this quiet car, carrying me further away from everything familiar and closer to something I had not yet named. The drive continued in silence for several minutes, the city gradually giving way to quieter streets lined with spaced-out buildings and dimmer lighting, until even the sound of traffic felt distant and controlled. I sat in the back seat of the car, my hands still resting in my lap, noticing how strange it felt to be moving without knowing the destination. Vincent Callahan had not spoken in a while, and neither had I, yet the silence no longer felt as sharp as before. It felt structured, almost intentional, like even the absence of words was part of something he controlled. I watched his reflection faintly in the window, his posture unchanged, his attention forward, as if the environment itself required constant awareness. Eventually, the car turned into a private driveway marked by tall gates that opened without hesitation, revealing a long, softly lit path leading toward a large residence set back from the street. The structure was modern but understated, with clean lines and muted lighting that made it feel less like a display of wealth and more like something built for privacy rather than attention. The car slowed and came to a smooth stop near the entrance, and for the first time since leaving the hotel, Vincent turned fully toward me. "We are here," he said simply, as if that explained everything. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping out of the car, immediately noticing how quiet the surroundings were compared to the city. The air felt cooler, the space wider, and I suddenly became aware of how long it had been since I had been somewhere that did not feel crowded or constantly in motion. Vincent led the way without urgency, walking slightly ahead, but never far enough that I could not follow easily. The front door opened as we approached, and inside the lighting shifted again, softer and warmer, revealing an interior that was minimal but carefully arranged, with neutral colors and clean surfaces that gave the impression of order rather than decoration. I stepped inside slowly, unsure of where to place myself, while Vincent closed the door behind us and finally allowed the outside world to disappear completely. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I stood near the entrance, taking in the space, realizing how different it felt from the places I was used to, not just in size or design, but in atmosphere, as if everything inside had been intentionally removed of distraction. Vincent finally moved past me, setting something down on a nearby surface before turning slightly. "You will stay here tonight," he said calmly. I looked at him immediately, surprised by how direct the statement was, but there was no hesitation in his voice, no invitation for debate. "This location is secure," he added after a brief pause, as if that was the only reassurance necessary. I shifted slightly, trying to process everything at once, still unsure of what exactly I was stepping into. "And tomorrow?" I asked quietly. "What happens tomorrow?" Vincent studied me for a moment, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that suggested calculation rather than uncertainty. "Tomorrow depends on what I confirm tonight," he said. The answer was not comforting, but it was honest in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. I nodded slowly, unsure what else to do with information that felt incomplete but final at the same time. Vincent stepped further into the room, then paused as if considering something before speaking again. "You are not being held here," he said carefully. "But you are also not being returned to where I found you until I am certain it is safe." That distinction settled heavily in my mind, not as threat, but as a boundary I did not yet fully understand. I looked around the quiet interior again, realizing I was no longer outside, no longer moving through the city, but standing in a place that felt separate from everything I had known earlier that night. Vincent remained calm, observant, and distant in the way someone is when they are responsible for outcomes rather than emotions. And for the first time since this began, I understood clearly that whatever had started at the hotel was still far from finished. The interior of the house remained quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar to me. Not empty, but carefully controlled, as if every sound had a place and nothing was left to chance. I stood near the entrance for a moment longer than necessary, still processing the fact that I had followed Vincent Callahan into a space I had never imagined stepping into. He moved further inside without rushing, adjusting his jacket slightly before gesturing subtly toward a hallway that led deeper into the residence. "You can sit in the living area," he said calmly, his voice carrying the same steady control I had begun to recognize as his normal way of speaking. I hesitated, then slowly followed, noticing how the lighting shifted again as I moved away from the entrance, becoming warmer and softer, like the house was designed to reduce tension rather than create it. The living space opened into a wide, minimal room with large windows that showed the distant glow of the city far beyond the property, now reduced to scattered points of light. I lowered myself onto the edge of a sofa, careful not to fully relax, unsure if I was supposed to. Vincent remained standing for a moment near a table across the room, checking something on a device I could not see clearly before setting it down again. Only then did he finally sit, not across from me, but slightly angled, as if direct confrontation was unnecessary. The silence returned, but it felt different here, less like uncertainty and more like waiting. I broke it first, my voice quieter than I intended. "I do not understand what is happening," I said honestly, watching him closely as I spoke. Vincent looked at me for a moment before responding, as if choosing words that would not overwhelm the situation. "You are not expected to understand everything tonight," he said. "You are expected to remain safe while I determine what risk remains." The way he spoke made it clear that safety, in his terms, was something actively managed, not something assumed. I looked down briefly at my hands, trying to steady my thoughts, then asked the question that had been building since the hotel. Why would anyone be interested in me? I said. It sounded simple, but it carried everything I could not articulate. Vincent did not respond immediately, and I noticed the smallest shift in his expression, not uncertainty, but consideration. You were in proximity to information you should not have been near, he said carefully. Sometimes that is enough for people to make assumptions about what you know. I felt a slight chill at the explanation, not because it was frightening in itself, but because it made my ordinary life feel suddenly misaligned with something far larger than me. I had never considered myself important in any way that mattered beyond my own responsibilities. Yet here I was, sitting in a place I did not belong, being told that my presence somewhere had created consequences I did not fully understand. Vincent continued after a brief pause. You will not be left unprotected, he said, his tone steady but firm. That is no longer negotiable. I looked up at him again, trying to find something in his expression that felt personal rather than procedural, but there was nothing performative about him, only certainty. The idea of protection sounded simple when spoken aloud, but in practice it felt like entering a system I could not see the edges of. Outside the windows, the city continued to glow quietly in the distance, unaware of the stillness inside this house. I leaned back slightly, not fully relaxing, but no longer standing in tension, and for the first time since the night began, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that I might not be able to return immediately to the life I had left only hours before. The night had grown quieter outside the large windows, the distant city lights of Manhattan now reduced to a soft glow that felt almost detached from where I was sitting inside Vincent Callahan's home. The silence between us had shifted again, no longer sharp or uncertain, but heavy with meaning that had not yet been fully spoken. I remained on the sofa, my posture still careful, my thoughts moving slower as exhaustion and confusion began to mix in a way I could not easily separate. Vincent stood near the edge of the room for a moment, looking out toward the darkened glass, as if confirming something only he could see, before finally turning back toward me. You are trying to place everything into something familiar, he said calmly, as if he could read the pattern of my thoughts without effort. I did not deny it because he was right. Everything that had happened still felt like it belonged to a version of reality I had not been prepared for, and I was trying to force it into something simpler so I could understand it. I just do not understand why this is happening to me, I said quietly, my voice steady but tired. Vincent approached slowly, not invading space, but closing the distance enough that the conversation felt more direct. Because you were present in a situation that carried weight beyond what you could see, he replied. That alone is enough for certain people to assume connection. I frowned slightly, trying to follow the logic, but it still felt incomplete. I had spent my entire life being ordinary, unnoticed, moving between shifts, bills, and routines that never extended beyond the edges of my own survival. The idea that my presence alone could create consequences I did not understand felt unreal, yet the calm certainty in his voice made it difficult to dismiss. Vincent paused for a moment before continuing. There are systems in this city that do not operate in public view, he said carefully. And when you step near them unknowingly, the reaction is not always directed at intent. Sometimes it is directed at proximity. I absorbed his words slowly, feeling the weight of them settle without fully forming into clarity. The house around us remained still, the soft lighting and quiet architecture reinforcing the sense that time itself had slowed. I glanced toward the window again, watching the faint movement of distant cars far below, and for a moment I wondered how many people outside were completely unaware that their world could overlap with something like this. Am I supposed to stay here? I asked after a long pause, not out of resistance, but genuine uncertainty about what my role was now. Vincent did not answer immediately, and when he did, his tone was measured. You are not required to remain, he said. But leaving before I confirm stability would not be responsible. The phrasing was deliberate, not commanding, but structured in a way that made the situation feel less like choice and more like timing. I nodded slightly, understanding that I was not being forced, yet also recognizing that I was being advised by someone who clearly understood more variables than I did. Vincent then added something after a brief silence. You will be informed when you can return to your normal routine, he said, as if such a concept still existed in the same form it had earlier that night. I looked at him more directly then, noticing again how composed he remained, as if emotional reaction was something he simply did not use in situations like this. There was no urgency in him, only control and continuity, and that alone made him difficult to interpret. I exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly against the sofa, my mind still working through fragments of explanation that did not yet connect fully. The city outside continued to glow in the distance, unchanged and unaware, while inside this quiet space, everything about my understanding of my own life had begun to shift into something I could not yet define. The room remained quiet after Vincent Callahan finished speaking, the kind of silence that did not feel empty, but instead felt carefully maintained, as if even the air inside the space was being managed with intention. I stayed where I was on the sofa, my hands now resting more loosely than before, though my mind was still trying to align everything I had been told with the reality I thought I knew only a few hours earlier. The city outside the large windows continued its distant movement, faint lights shifting across the horizon of Manhattan like nothing significant had changed, even though everything inside me already had. Vincent stood near the edge of the room for a moment longer, his attention briefly shifting toward a secure device on the table before returning to me. "The immediate situation has been contained," he said calmly, as if confirming a completed task rather than describing something that had affected my entire night. I looked at him carefully, still unsure how to respond to a statement that felt both reassuring and distant at the same time. "Contained," I repeated softly, testing the word as if it might reveal more meaning if I said it aloud. Vincent gave a slight nod. "Which means you are no longer in active exposure," he continued. "However, your circumstances remain under observation until every variable is verified." I did not fully understand what that meant, but I understood enough to know that whatever had started at the hotel was not something that ended quickly or simply. I shifted slightly on the sofa, my posture loosening just a little as exhaustion began to settle deeper into my body, though my thoughts remained alert. "What happens to me now?" I asked after a pause, my voice quieter than before, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. Vincent took a moment before answering, his tone measured and consistent. "You remain here temporarily," he said. "Not as restriction, but as precaution." I nodded slowly, trying to accept that distinction even if it still felt unfamiliar. The idea that safety could require distance from my normal life was still difficult to process, but I was beginning to understand that Vincent operated in a world where certainty mattered more than comfort. He stepped slightly closer again, though still maintaining a respectful distance. "Tomorrow there will be a review of the situation," he added. "After that, you will have clearer options." I looked up at him, noticing again how composed he remained, as if every possible outcome had already been accounted for in advance. There was no visible tension in him, no hesitation, only control that seemed constant rather than situational. For the first time, I realized that he was not reacting to events the way I would have reacted, but instead managing them as if they were already expected. I leaned back slightly, letting the weight of the evening settle into a quieter place inside me, though my awareness of everything around me remained heightened. The house itself stayed still, softly lit and structured in a way that felt intentionally calming, as if designed to remove uncertainty from the environment itself. Vincent eventually turned slightly toward the hallway. "You can rest," he said simply. I hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod, realizing how tired I had actually become without noticing it earlier. As he moved away, the space did not feel empty, only quieter, and for the first time since leaving the hotel, I allowed myself to sit in stillness without immediately searching for what might happen next. Outside, Manhattan continued to glow in the distance, unchanged and unaware, while inside this controlled silence, I began to understand that my life had not ended its normal rhythm, but had simply been placed somewhere else entirely, waiting for a version of tomorrow I could not yet imagine.